Every person who has ever changed their life, every athlete who became elite, every entrepreneur who built something real, every artist who created something that outlasted them, every ordinary human being who looked at the gap between who they were and who they wanted to be and actually closed it, did it with the same tool. And it was not motivation, it was not talent, it was not a perfect plan or a perfect environment or a perfect moment. It was discipline, and not the punishing, white-knuckled, grit-your-teeth version of discipline that most people imagine when they hear that word, but something far more sophisticated, far more psychologically nuanced, and far more accessible than popular culture has ever given it credit for being. And today, we are going to go completely inside the psychology of discipline, the neuroscience, the behavioral research, the cognitive architecture. And by the end of this video, you will understand not just what discipline is, but why some people seem to have it effortlessly and others seem constitutionally incapable of it. And more importantly, you will understand the precise psychological mechanism by which any human being, regardless of their history, their personality, or their current level of self-control, can build genuine, lasting, life-changing discipline from the ground up. Let's start by destroying the most damaging myth about discipline that exists. And that is the idea that discipline is a personality trait, something you either have or you don't, something born into some people and withheld from others, like a genetic lottery that determined your fate before you were old enough to make a single choice. This myth is not just wrong, it is actively harmful, because every time a person fails at maintaining a new behavior and concludes, "I'm just not a disciplined person," they are using a false psychological framework to cement a limiting identity that will govern every future attempt at change. The science is unambiguous on this point. Roy Baumeister's foundational research at Florida State University demonstrated that self-control, the psychological mechanism at the heart of discipline, is not a fixed trait, but a dynamic resource, more like a muscle than a personality feature, which means it fatigues under load and strengthens with training, which means the undisciplined person is not someone who lacks discipline, but someone who has not yet systematically trained it, which is an entirely different psychological situation with an entirely different set of solutions. The person who believes discipline is a trait they lack will wait to feel discipline before acting, will interpret every failure of self-control as confirmation of their fundamental inadequacy, and will remain exactly where they are indefinitely. The person who understands discipline as a trainable skill will approach it with the same strategic, progressive methodology that a serious athlete brings to physical training, starting where they actually are, building incrementally, managing recovery, and understanding that the process of building the capacity is itself the work, not a prerequisite for it. Now, let's go deeper into what is actually happening in the brain during moments of discipline and moments of its failure. Because this neurological understanding is not just academically interesting, it is practically essential for building discipline that actually holds under real-world conditions. Your brain contains two systems that are in constant, dynamic tension with each other, and the quality of your discipline at any given moment is almost entirely a function of which system is currently winning. The first system, sometimes called the limbic system or the emotional brain, is ancient, fast, and extraordinarily powerful. It operates on the basis of immediate reward and immediate threat. It processes information in milliseconds and its primary motivation is to move you toward pleasure and away from pain in the shortest possible time. This is the system that reaches for the phone when you should be working, that chooses the couch when you plan the gym, that orders the food you didn't intend to order and buys the thing you didn't intend to buy and says the word you immediately wish you could unsay. The second system, the prefrontal cortex, the rational brain, is newer in evolutionary terms, slower in processing, and responsible for long-term planning, impulse control, abstract reasoning, and the capacity to delay immediate gratification in service of a larger future reward. This is the system that knows you should exercise, that understands compound interest, that can see the gap between your current behavior and your desired life with painful clarity. Discipline, at its most fundamental neurological level, is the trained capacity of the prefrontal cortex to override the limbic system's immediate impulses. But here is what most people miss entirely, and what changes everything when you finally understand it. This override capacity is not unlimited. It is not consistent across the day, and it is profoundly sensitive to physical and psychological conditions in ways that make a purely willpower-based approach to discipline not just difficult, but biologically doomed from the start. Baumeister's ego depletion research showed that every act of self-control draws on the same finite pool of cognitive resources. And as that pool depletes across the day, through decisions, through resisting temptations, through social performance, through stress, the prefrontal cortex's ability to override the limbic system diminishes measurably and predictably. This is why your discipline is strongest in the morning and weakest at night. This is why you make worse decisions when you are hungry, tired, or emotionally depleted. This is why the person who successfully avoids sugar all day is statistically more likely to binge in the evening, not because they lack willpower, but because they spent all of it. And understanding this physiological reality is not an excuse for failure. It is the foundation for designing a disciplined life that works with your brain's actual operating parameters rather than against them. The most disciplined people in the world are not the ones who rely most heavily on willpower. They are the ones who have designed their lives to require the least willpower possible, and this distinction is the key that unlocks everything. Let's now talk about the single most important concept in the entire psychology of discipline, and that is the concept of environment design, because research by behavioral scientists, including Brian Wansink, Richard Thaler, and B.J. Fogg, consistently demonstrates that the environment in which behavior occurs is a more powerful determinant of that behavior than the intentions, values, or motivation of the person performing it. What this means in practice is almost shockingly simple. The most effective path to disciplined behavior is not to try harder, not to want it more, not to find deeper motivation or more compelling reasons. It is to design your physical, social, and digital environment so that the disciplined behavior is the path of least resistance, and the undisciplined behavior requires active effort to access. The person who is trying to eat healthily and keeps junk food in the house is fighting their environment with their willpower every single hour of every single day, and they will lose that fight with mathematical inevitability because environments beat intentions almost every time over long enough time horizons. The person who simply doesn't bring junk food into the house eliminates the fight entirely. The disciplined behavior happens automatically, not because their willpower increased, but because their environment removed the decision point where willpower was required. This is what psychologist B.J. Fogg at Stanford calls motivation-independent behavior change. Designing the conditions under which the desired behavior is so frictionless and the undesired behavior is so effortful that the behavior happens without requiring ongoing motivational input, which is the only kind of behavioral change that is genuinely sustainable across the long timescales that real-life transformation requires. Now, let's examine the relationship between discipline and identity, because this is where the psychology of discipline stops being about tactics and becomes about something much deeper and much more durable. James Clear's framework of identity-based habits, drawn from extensive research in behavioral psychology and habit formation, articulates something that is simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. Every time you perform a disciplined behavior, you cast a vote for the identity of a person who does that behavior. And every time you fail to perform it, you cast a vote for the opposite identity. The accumulation of these votes over time and across thousands of small behavioral moments is what determines not just what you do, but who you believe yourself to be. And who you believe yourself to be is the most powerful governor of future behavior that psychology has ever identified. This means that the goal of building discipline is not ultimately about building a set of behaviors. It is about building a self-concept in which disciplined behavior is the natural expression of who you are, rather than a constant battle against who you are. The person who is trying to exercise more will always experience the gym as an act of willpower. The person who has internalized the identity of I am someone who trains experiences skipping the gym as the uncomfortable deviation from their norm, not going as the uncomfortable imposition on their comfort. And the pathway from the first identity to the second is not a single dramatic decision. It is the accumulation of small, consistent, imperfect, repeated actions that gradually rewrite the self-concept from the inside, one behavioral vote at a time. Now, let's talk about the role of systems versus goals in building lasting discipline, because this distinction is one of the most practically impactful insights in all of behavioral psychology, and one of the most consistently misunderstood by people trying to change their behavior. Most people approach discipline through goals. They identify a desired outcome and then attempt to maintain the motivation and self-control necessary to reach it, which creates a psychological structure that is inherently unstable because motivation is variable, self-control is depletable, and the goal exists in the future, where it provides no guidance for the behavioral decisions that must be made in the present. The research of psychologists Peter Gollwitzer and Gabriele Oettingen on implementation intentions demonstrates that the gap between intention and action, the gap where most discipline fails, is bridged most effectively not by increased motivation, but by the pre-specification of exactly when, where, and how the desired behavior will occur. I will exercise is an intention. I will do 20 minutes of movement immediately after I make my morning coffee, before I open my phone in my living room, is an implementation intention. And the research shows that implementation intentions increase follow-through by up to 300% compared to simple goal setting alone. Not because they increase motivation, but because they automate the decision, removing the moment of choice where temptation, fatigue, and the limbic system's preference for comfort have their opportunity to win. Systems thinking applied to discipline means designing a set of environmental conditions, time structures, behavioral triggers, and automatic decision rules that make the disciplined behavior happen as a matter of routine rather than as a matter of ongoing willpower expenditure. And the person who operates from a well-designed system will consistently outperform the person of equal or greater motivation who is operating from pure intention with no systematic support. Let's now address the most underestimated obstacle to discipline. And that is not laziness, not lack of motivation, not even the dopamine-driven pull of digital distraction, but the mismanagement of recovery and the chronic confusion between rest and laziness that causes people to either burn out from unsustainable intensity or feel guilty for the rest that their biology genuinely requires. The highest performers in every domain, elite athletes, top surgeons, concert pianists, Nobel Prize-winning researchers, are almost universally characterized not just by the quality and intensity of their focused work, but by the deliberateness and non-negotiability of their recovery. Anders Ericsson's research on deliberate practice, the most comprehensive study of expert performance ever conducted, found that elite performers typically work in focused sessions of no more than 90 minutes before requiring recovery, and that the total volume of deliberate practice sustainable per day across all domains studied clustered consistently around 4 to 5 hours of genuinely focused effort, after which the quality of performance degrades so significantly that additional time produces not additional progress, but the rehearsal of error and the building of bad habits. The person who understands this uses their disciplined energy in concentrated, high-quality bursts and then recovers without guilt, because they understand that recovery is not the enemy of discipline. It is the biological prerequisite for it. The person who doesn't understand this either pushes past the point of productive effort and accumulates fatigue and resentment until the discipline collapses entirely, or interprets the natural need for rest as evidence of their own inadequacy and enters a shame spiral that makes returning to the disciplined behavior increasingly difficult with each cycle. Now let's talk about what happens when discipline fails. Because it will fail. It fails for everyone. And the psychology of how a person responds to that failure is perhaps more determinative of their long-term disciplined behavior than any other single factor. Research by psychologists Claire Adams and Mark Leary on what they call the "what the hell" effect, also known as the abstinence violation effect in addiction research, demonstrates that a single failure of discipline, when interpreted through a perfectionist framework, tends to trigger a cascading abandonment of the disciplined behavior entirely. The person who breaks their diet with one cookie and then says, "What the hell, the day is ruined," and eats the entire kitchen is not demonstrating a failure of discipline. They are demonstrating a failure of self-compassion that turns a small behavioral deviation into a complete behavioral collapse. The research of Kristen Neff at the University of Texas on self-compassion, which she defines as treating yourself with the same kindness, understanding, and perspective that you would offer a good friend in an equivalent situation, consistently shows that self-compassion predicts greater resilience, greater consistency, and greater long-term behavioral success than self-criticism, which is the precise opposite of what the popular mythology around discipline would have you believe. Most people think that being hard on themselves when they fail is what motivates them to do better. But the neurological reality is that harsh self-criticism activates the threat response system, floods the body with cortisol, narrows cognitive flexibility, and makes the return to disciplined behavior neurologically more difficult, while self-compassion activates the care system, reduces threat arousal, maintains the psychological safety necessary for learning from failure, and makes the behavioral recovery faster, more complete, and more sustainable. The most disciplined people are not the ones who never fail. They are the ones who fail and return fastest, with the least amount of self-inflicted psychological damage in between. And now, let's bring every thread of this conversation together into the single most important truth about the psychology of discipline. The truth that, if genuinely understood and genuinely internalized, changes not just how you approach self-control, but how you understand yourself and your relationship to time, to potential, to the gap between who you are today and who you are demonstrably capable of becoming. Discipline is not something you find. It is not something you are given. It is not something that arrives when the motivation is high enough, the circumstances are right enough, or the version of you that has it all figured out finally shows up. Discipline is something you build brick by brick, behavior by behavior, recovery by recovery, in the specific, unglamorous, largely unwitnessed daily territory of ordinary moments that nobody will ever celebrate or record or notice except you. It is built in the moment you do the thing when you don't feel like doing it. It is built in the moment you design the environment instead of blaming the temptation. It is built in the moment you return to the behavior after the failure without making the failure mean something catastrophic about your character. It is built in the moment you choose the system over the mood, the identity over the impulse, the person you are becoming over the comfort of who you have always been. And every one of those moments, small and quiet and unremarkable as they are, deposits something into a compound account of capability, identity, and self-trust that pays returns not just in the specific domain where the discipline was practiced, but across every area of your life simultaneously, because the person who has learned to do hard things consistently has not just built a habit. They have built a self. They have built the irreplaceable, unshakable knowledge that they can be relied upon by the most important person in their life, which is themselves. And that knowledge, that bone-deep, experientially earned, behaviorally proven self-trust, is not just the product of discipline. It is the most valuable thing that discipline, and only discipline, can ever build. Subscribe for more mind secrets.